Does cognitive dissonance explain the origins of Christianity? Does it actually solve some of the problems that we see in the early sources? I'm going to play a short clip from N.T. Wright, who says absolutely not. It cannot explain the origins of Christianity. And you have to ask yourself the question, is he really interested in the historical research and understanding what's going on here? Or is he kind of grinding to show his position to be true and that Christianity is unlike anything out there? There's nothing comparable, and that this Jesus resurrection is the most plausible explanation for all of the data.
We know of at least a dozen Messianic or prophetic movements between roughly 100 years before Jesus and roughly 100 years after Jesus, ending with the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 130s AD. In each of those cases, the movement ended with the violent death of the founder, as far as we can tell. When that happened, and there are several movements which crop up in the historian Josephus, we can track them, and I've written about these as others have done. When that happened, when the founder dies, the followers have a choice. They can either clear off and forget the movement, this whole kingdom of God idea, we're not going to get into that mess anymore, or they get another leader. Going around saying that the original leader has been raised from the dead is not an option, even though if they were loyal Pharisaic Jews, as many of them were, resurrection would be very much in their minds, that that's what we're aiming for, the kingdom of God, the raising of all the dead. But not one person coming back in the middle of history. And I've sometimes fantasized and imagined, say, after the death of Simon Bar Giora, who was the Messiah of the war period, 66 to 70, who the Romans killed at the end of Titus's triumph in Rome in 72. If somebody the next day had said, I think God has raised him from the dead, and his friends might say, what do you mean God has raised him from the dead? And if the person had said, oh, well, he always said that one day there'll be a glorious resurrection, so maybe that's happened, then his friends would say, don't be so stupid. They've just killed him. We've just buried him. What do you mean he's raised from the dead? And if somebody at that point would come out with a sort of Bultmannian explanation, oh, well, we have a sense of his presence with us. We have a sense that our sins have been forgiven. They would say, well, maybe he is in some sense present. Maybe our sins have been forgiven, but why did you say he's been raised from the dead? That's not what that means. So I think once we start to think historically about what people actually knew, believed, expected, anticipated, and how they reacted as first century Jews, those theories simply fall away, and we're left with this very stark and striking claim, which was stark and striking in the first century as it is today, that they say that the tomb was empty and that they really did experience Jesus in a new, transformed physicality, which seemed capable of inhabiting in both heaven and earth and moving easily between the two. That's a very strange thing, and Jesus never talked about that in advance, and nor, as far as we can tell, did any of the Jewish writers who wrote about resurrection. So there's all sorts of new things which come out in the resurrection stories and Paul's theories about resurrection, for which they were unprepared, and for which theories like that of Pesch, and even the rather different theories of Dale Allison, simply don't address.
Yeah, so this argument is probably the most popular argument against cognitive dissonance theory as an explanation for how Christianity began, why it took the shape that it did. Wright, the most extensive place that he really explains this argument is in his book, The Resurrection of the Son of God, 2003, his magnum opus on the resurrection, large 700-page book. He spends like 600 pages arguing for his position on the historical trustworthiness of the resurrection, of the early Christian claim that Jesus rose from the dead. And then he begins to address some counter arguments and some possible, non-miraculous alternatives to the resurrection hypothesis. And the first alternative explanation that he addresses is cognitive dissonance theory. And his main argument is that cognitive dissonance theory can't explain Christian origins because we have evidence of a number of different Messianic movements that arose in the first century. And when their leaders, when the Messianic claimants at the head of those movements died, the movements died with them. We have no evidence of any other movement in the first century that is similar in any way to early Christianity that continued after the death of their leader and continued to, kind of double down and say, no, he's still alive. He is, we are continuing to believe that he is the Messiah. What you could do is pack up and find another Messiah. That was your option. But they wouldn't go around saying, no, he's still the Messiah. We still believe it. There's a couple problems with this. The first major problem is that it's an argument from silence. And I think in that clip, he says, as far as we know, and that as far as we know is carrying a heck of a lot of weight in that argument, because we know next to nothing about most other Messianic movements from that period. The only reason we know as much as we do know, such as it is, about early Christianity, is because early Christianity succeeded. And so Wright is kind of relying on a survivor bias here in saying that, well, because, our movement survived, and because it survived, we have maintained the tradition of the texts associated with this movement. But most of those other movements, the only things we know about them is what the history books that we have choose to say about them, which are usually just a sentence or two related to the Jewish wars in 66 to 70, or, Simon Bar Kokhba with the Jewish revolt in AD 135. And there was just no reason to talk about them. I think, analogously, comparing those movements to the kinds of movements that sociologists, anthropologists, social psychologists study today in talking about cognitive dissonance theory, movements like the movement that Leon Festinger studied in his seminal work, When Prophecy Fails, in the 1950s, we wouldn't know anything about that movement and how they responded to the failure of their expectations if it wasn't for the fact that Leon Festinger and his team of researchers were studying that group and saw in real time how they responded. Mm-hmm. Nobody would have been interested in them, otherwise. And I mean, probably the most famous example of failed prophecy in the 21st century is a guy named Harold Camping. Predicted the end of the world in 2011. And when it didn't come, he reinterpreted things a couple times. And then when those dates passed, he said, okay, I was wrong. That all got a lot of publicity. And then he died shortly after that. And most people think that was the end of the matter. His prophecies failed. He eventually
people stopped following.
People stopped following. That was the end of the movement. Most people don't know that's actually not the case. There is still a group of Campingite followers, even in spite of the fact that he said, yes, I was wrong. A lot of his followers still believe that Jesus actually did begin his end time judgment. They've reinterpreted things so that it fits with the fact that Jesus didn't return like they expected on May 21st, 2011. But they continue to think that May 21st, 2011 was the time when the end began. And you can look up a group called E-Bible Fellowship on YouTube, and they have a ton of material arguing for the end times beginning and kind of the doors of the gates of salvation closing on May 21st, 2011. And it's a fascinating movement. But we wouldn't know anything about that group if we didn't have the internet. Basically, they would just be some isolated group somewhere that nobody, we wouldn't have any record of. And the media doesn't have any real interest in them. So how much less would we have any information about these groups in the first century, 2,000 years removed? Having said that, though, we actually do have data on a couple movements from the first century that really did maintain faith despite their leader's death. And Wright doesn't mention these groups at all. He doesn't account for them. But the first is a Samaritan sect called the Dissithians. And the Dissithians, they followed a guy named Disitheus who proclaimed himself as the Messiah, and they continued to believe that he was the Messiah after their death. And the interesting thing about them is that we wouldn't really know this detail, that they continued to believe that he was the Messiah after his death, if it wasn't for the fact that Origen, in his commentary on the Gospel of John, mentions them in discussing the Samaritan woman at the well that Jesus talks to at the well, and they have a conversation. That conversation turns to talking about the Messiah, and she says, I know that the Messiah will come, and we're waiting for him. And Jesus says, I, who am speaking to you, am he. And Origen, commenting on that, recognizes that, well, the Samaritans did have, around this time in the first century, a Messiah who is in many ways strangely comparable to Jesus. But the interesting thing about that fragment, and it is a fragment, is that we don't have the complete text of Origen's commentary on the Gospel of John. And this passage, or it's, book 13 of Origen's commentary, only was translated into English in 2006. And that's 3 years after Wright wrote his book on the resurrection and argued against cognitive dissonance. So I don't know if he had access to this when he wrote that book, but here is the relevant passage where Origen speaks about the Dissithians. He says, "We must not fail to remark that just as Jesus arose from among the Jews, not only saying that he was the Christ, but also demonstrating it, so also a certain Disitheus arose from among the Samaritans and declared that he himself was the Christ who had been prophesied. To this day, there are Dissithians." So to this day, Origen writing in the 2nd century, speaking about a group probably that existed in the 1st century. We don't know exactly when the Dissithians were active or when Disitheus was alive, but most scholars think it was in the 1st century. To this day, there are Dissithians derived from him who bring forward books of Disitheus and certain stories about him, very similar to the Gospels, describing how he did not taste death, but is alive somewhere. So for this group, they continued, despite their Messianic founder's death, they continued to believe that he was the Messiah. And in order to believe that he was the Messiah, they maintained that he didn't actually die. That's pretty interesting. And I mean, Origen recognizes how similar it is to the claims that the early Christians were making, and he makes that direct comparison between them. But we also have to talk about John the Baptist, because John the Baptist, most Christians read about John the Baptist from the Gospels, and so they assume John the Baptist was a prophet and he was a forerunner of Jesus. But most critical scholars recognize that the way that John the Baptist is being portrayed in the Gospels is there's an agenda going on in the Gospels that is intentionally placing John the Baptist below Jesus. And the reason that they are so invested, I mean, in John 3 is a good example of this. John 3, you have on John the Baptist's lips saying, "Oh, I must decrease and he must increase." The reason the Gospels are so interested in doing that is because there were still followers of John the Baptist after his death. And we have evidence. Joel Marcus has a phenomenal book on John the Baptist called John the Baptist in History and Theology. And he, in the first several chapters of that book, argues really persuasively, going into the Clementine literature in the 3rd and 4th century, and shows how some followers of John the Baptist continued to believe in him, not just as a prophet, but as the Messiah. They believed that John the Baptist was the Messiah and that Jesus was not the Messiah. And they were in direct competition with the early Christians into the 3rd and 4th centuries. And I mean, that raises the question, like, how could they believe that he was the Messiah, even though he had died? And that points us back to the Gospels and some of those strange passages in the Gospels where some people mistake Jesus for John the Baptist, and they think, well, some people thought that Jesus was John the Baptist risen from the dead. And it's speculative, but there are scholars who argue that the way that John the Baptist's followers continued to maintain their faith in him as the Messiah after his death was by believing that he had risen from the dead. You can't prove that, but we have next to nothing to go on in all these sources. And Christian apologists like to argue that the only way that the early Christians could have believed that Jesus's followers maintained belief in him after his death, as the Messiah after his death, was the resurrection. How could they believe that he was a Messiah unless he had risen from the dead? A dead Messiah was no Messiah at all. And so if that argument stands for Jesus, doesn't it also stand for John the Baptist? How could they maintain faith in him as the Messiah after his death? Maybe they believed that he rose from the dead. That's speculative, but it's clear that they did believe, followers of John the Baptist did believe that he was the Messiah into the 3rd and 4th centuries. That is pretty well established. And it seems that some people believed that Jesus was John the Baptist, risen from the dead. And so there was a close association between them. And I think those two examples of Dissonance and John the Baptist show pretty clearly that the claim that Wright makes about first century Messianic movements and them not maintaining faith in their leader after his death simply isn't true. It doesn't have support.
I want to add icing to your cake, and then you can do the cherry on top, because I always get the gears going in your head. Number one is, thank you for two examples. One, I would say, is really, really solid. Dissonance. Why is this Christian apologist church father saying this? Okay. What the heck? You're not helping your case. Don't you see the 21st century? No, he doesn't. So we're in the Enlightenment phase, looking and examining, and we have different values that we're approaching this with than they did. They didn't mind their cousin groups and brother groups and sister groups looking like them, or even the fact, as Justin Martyr points out, comparisons to the Zeus and sons of Zeus and all that kind of stuff. No problem there. But I don't want to get off topic to that. I want to focus on this resurrection thing, because what you said nails something hard. Okay. First thing I want to say is this. Now I know why N.T. Wright really wants to emphasize physical resurrection as a Jewish ubiquitous thing, and really wants to nail that, because even if you granted, this Dissonance thing, well, did he die? It says he didn't taste death, and that meant he wasn't resurrected physically. So no matter what you do, my friend, he's going to wiggle out of this, because I don't think it's just a historian thing. There's an apologetic, and they're driven with an apologetic, because he needs that physical death, resurrection, Jewishness, as he's tried to make the case through and through. But also what I find interesting is how much we don't know. So what you do is you're just giving two examples. We don't have a lot of stuff, and we don't know how many groups thought their person was still alive. We have this Acts apologetic by the author who's saying, look at all these other people, their movements have died out, but Jesus has survived. And we have this. It doesn't mention this Dissonance guy. It doesn't mention possibly who knows how many other groups are out there actually believing their person's not dead. I say that to say, I think there's something interesting about mystery that allows this to be the case. Okay. So why did they? The question would be like, why did the Dissonance believe Dissonance never tasted death? We don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't be shocked if there was a curious mystery of not knowing where he went, not knowing how he got to where he went. There is a missing body trope translation, as Richard C. Miller talks about. And when they go missing, it is assumed they have become a god or they have become deified. Oftentimes, even Jehovah's Witnesses, I think one side of the Jehovah's Witnesses, one of the Seventh-day Adventists, one of these cult-type groups think that one of the disciples is still alive today. Because Jesus said, some of you standing here will not taste death. John 21 talks about this guy who never dies. So they hold to this idea that one of them's not alive. Well, they have no way to falsify it. So it can stay alive because it's not falsifiable. In the earliest gospel we have in Mark, you have the disciples flee. They do not stick around when Jesus is handled by the Romans. Once they have him in the kangaroo case and it's over, they're off the scene. They're like, they're not watching what's happening. So Jesus gets killed. They have no way of knowing what is going on with him. Of course, the story paints that he's buried in a tomb, but it's mysterious. it leaves room for who knows what. So I want to give one other example that I thought was interesting, and I brought this up to you in the book of Revelation. John Dominic Crossan points this out in his work, talking about render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, the name of the book. It's a really good book. In Revelation, he highlights some really interesting things about the mark of the beast, the 660 and 6, this idea about the Sibylline oracles playing a role in the knowledge of this author in their writing against Rome. And in it, even in the Sibylline oracles, as well as hinted here in this revelation, that Nero is going to take a fatal wound. Nero dies, but does not stay dead, comes back. And the Nero Redivivus myth of a man who was dead is alive again and is going to lead an army. The Parthians, the Romans feared what might happen to that. The Jews were hoping, at least these ones were particularly hoping, come on, bring the Parthians to destroy them. Some of them feared that they themselves would be destroyed in it. It's never one-stop shop, right? But the fact that they honestly believed, and there's like 2 or 3 historical imposters, because the myth was so prevalent that there were men who claimed to be Nero actually running in, and like people were convinced, oh my God, it's Nero, and they got arrested and put to death and stuff like that. Like, that's a big deal that there are people actually thinking that, like, hold on, Nero's alive. Why would they, like, doesn't this speak of the superstition of the time that they think here's a guy who was dead? Nobody saw him get killed. It's documented in some of the historians that he may have committed suicide. There may have been a wound to the head. Someone might have assassinated him. We don't know how Nero died. Mystery creates hypotheses, and hypotheses that are superstitious ones at that. So here you have this Jesus guy, here you have this Dissithius guy, here you have John the Baptist. And notice, even in the Gospels, whether you think this is a good account or not for what you're saying, notice it's like he doesn't know. There's a mystery here. This guy looks like John the Baptist. Well, hold on, I thought we put this guy to death, but Herod obviously didn't see him maybe get killed. Who knows? Maybe it's an echo of something, of a memory. I don't know, but it's an interesting, again, another mystery. And he wants to pin the tail on the donkey here and go, that might be John the Baptist, but he's dead. Maybe he's back. This seems to be telling us about the ideas in the air at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very clear in Revelation that Jesus there is a parallel, a contrasting parallel between Nero and the Nero Redivivus myth, the beast, and the rider on the white horse, and the armies of heaven that he leads. And there's a clear parallel and contrast there, which in the kind of anti-imperial or anti-Roman Empire vision of Revelation is clearly combating that Roman imperial propaganda, and it is pulling on that Nero Redivivus myth and kind of using it for its own ends. So that myth was alive and well, and the early Christians were impacted by it. They were definitely in dialogue with that stuff. Another point, though, about Wright's argument, because he specifically cites Josephus, and we've talked about this before, but he says, first century Jews seem to have been more hard-headed than 20th century flying saucer devotees. That's what Wright says is they were more hard-headed. Cognitive dissonance doesn't seem to have been a factor for those first century Jewish Messianic movements. And he says, we don't see much evidence of cognitive dissonance in Josephus. And he's speaking of Josephus's account of the Jewish wars and his account of the different Messianic movements, Simon Bar Giora, in the revolt of 66 to 70. But what's really ironic about him citing Josephus specifically is that the whole point, Josephus's whole apologetic point in writing his Jewish wars, in writing his Antiquities of the Jews, is to present a version of Judaism which has been revised and made palatable to a Roman audience. He is trying to smooth out those tensions between Rome and Judaism and make Judaism respectable. But in doing that, Josephus talks about a lot of the superstitions that the Jews had in believing that a Messiah was coming, and that he would deliver him, and how those beliefs, those Messianic beliefs, fueled the revolt that led to the Jewish wars. But then he says what they didn't understand is that the prophecies that they were clinging to about an anointed king weren't actually about Simon Bar Giora or any other of these Jewish would-be messiahs. Those prophecies were actually about Vespasian. They were actually about the Roman emperor, and he is the anointed king. And so even in Josephus, you see his whole work, there is an apologetic interest in reinterpreting the prophetic traditions that he has inherited and making them viable in the new world that he was living in, where the temple had been destroyed and the previous expectations that he held to were dashed. And he was finding a way to maintain faith in a revised, expanded, new, a Judaism that could survive, that was viable in a situation where his previous faith could not survive. And that also, I think, points out another thing about Wright's argument, is that he seems to have a pretty shallow view of cognitive dissonance, because he talks about it as if the go-to response of people in responding to failed expectations is simply to double down. So they simply double down and cling to faith in spite of the fact that prophecy has failed. And he says that doesn't describe the early Christians, because they weren't expecting Jesus to die, and they weren't expecting one man. They weren't expecting the Messiah to rise prior to the general resurrection. And so because they weren't expecting that, this was a surprising new belief, and cognitive dissonance doesn't predict that. And that's a pretty gross error. That's a pretty big misunderstanding of what cognitive dissonance actually predicts, because Leon Festinger, in his book A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance from 1957, goes into responses to dissonance. And one of the primary ways that people respond to dissonance is by adding new cognitive elements, things that they didn't previously hold to be true, but they're rationalizations. It's bringing new information on board in order to shore up the core of your previous beliefs. But reinterpretation, rationalization, things that you didn't previously believe, things that you didn't previously expect, but things that help you maintain faith in spite of the failure of your previous expectations. And it's that rationalization, that reinterpretation point that Wright doesn't seem to get. But I mean, you can look at any number of examples of, failed prophetic expectations and the way that groups maintain faith. I mean, the Campingites, they weren't expecting, prior to May 21st, 2011, they weren't saying that date would mark the beginning of God's judgment. They weren't saying that it would mark a heavenly coming where the gates of heaven close and the offer of salvation is no longer available, but that Jesus hasn't actually come physically. No, they were saying it was the physical second coming, the big climactic end of all things. And they reinterpreted that. Same thing if you're talking about the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Seventh-day Adventists or the followers of Sabbatai Zevi. In all of those cases, they radically reinterpreted their previous expectation and said things after the fact that they never would have imagined saying beforehand. And so that argument that the followers of Jesus weren't expecting him to rise in advance of the general resurrection just completely misunderstands what dissonance theory actually claims.